So good morning, everybody. I think Demetrius has done a great job of setting the stage for us for this all-star panel. So we're going to spend the next hour really unpacking some of the things that Demetrius teed up for us and talking a little bit about how these emerging technologies can enhance SME growth. We'll talk about the right policy framework, and we'll talk about innovations among SMEs. And then our panelists will talk a little bit about how they're working to set the right ecosystem that promote digital trade flows, modernize customs procedures, and then ultimately result in economic inclusion. So our format is going to be that each one of our panelists is going to do a bit of a 5-minute introduction from their perspective on the issues, and then we'll go into some Q&A. I think you have all of their bios, so I won't go into them. I'll just introduce them one by one. First, we'll hear from Matthew Reisman, who's the Director of International Trade at Microsoft. Next, Brian Bieron, the Executive Director of Global Public Policy at eBay, will talk about how technology is enabling small business trade. And then Ralph Carter, who's the Vice President of International Regulatory Affairs at FedEx. I'm introducing all these people, and you know all these people, but I'm going to do it anyway. But Ralph is going to discuss the physical side of e-commerce, including the movement of goods and trade facilitation. And then rounding out the panel, Jennifer Taylor Hodges, Vice President of U.S. Government Affairs at BT Group, will discuss the role of communications providers in global value chains. So first, I'll turn it over to you, Matthew.
Thank you so much, Sarah, and thank you so much to CSI for the opportunity to be here today. I'd like to lead my remarks actually with a question. It's a question for everybody in the room. Why do you do what you do? If you're an international affairs professional or in economics or an international trade policy professional, like I think so many of us are, what is it that gets you out of bed to do this work? And I really would love to hear your answer if we have a chance to talk after this session. But I wanted to share with you a little bit of what brings me to this work. For me, I believe in trade policy and the work we do very deeply because I believe when we get these policies right, we give people opportunities to succeed and to prosper in ways that they never dreamed were possible before. That's what brought me to this work. It's what keeps me doing it to this day. And I have a feeling many of you share that same passion. And I think the most obvious way this is true is stories that we're going to hear a lot about, I think, throughout the day, which is businesses of every size who may be fledgling, may be very small, who can reach markets they never could before by exporting. I think those are amazing stories. You're going to hear a lot of them. But I actually want to focus on something a little bit different. And that's that there are so many other ways that good trade policy really makes a difference in people's lives. And so from where I sit at Microsoft, I have the privilege of seeing what the most amazing new technologies are doing to touch people's lives everywhere around the globe in all sorts of circumstances. And here, I hope you won't mind if I pivot to a story. So my first job in international affairs was while I was a college student. I was doing relief work in the Balkans after some pretty nasty wars there. And the program I was working with was helping refugees start businesses to try and reestablish a livelihood. But there was a problem. There were many problems that made this project really hard to succeed. Among them, that's relevant for the work I do today, is they were in a really isolated rural area. There was little to no connectivity, and there was little to no technology. That is a really bad place to start if you're trying to build a business. And so I fast forward 20 years now later, and I think about how much more we could do today to help folks in those situations with the technologies that we have now. And really, that's what I'm thinking about with the technologies that we're working on. So at Microsoft, really the focus of our work is around data, not our data. It's your data, and it's how we can help you through the cloud or through artificial intelligence to derive value from that you never dreamed was possible. So now let's go back to Croatia and think about those people we were trying to help. Some of the folks we were working with wanted to start craft businesses. What if, with just a broadband connection and a computer, you could identify customers you never could before? You could organize your administrative operations better than you ever could before? You could find the most efficient sources for the clay or the raw materials that you wanted to use to build your products, whereas in the past you were subject to just the few sources that were nearby. This is all possible now, and it wasn't then. I've talked a lot about it, but I think maybe the best way to show the power of what's possible today is to show you a video. Now, it's a Microsoft video, but I'm not here to do a Microsoft commercial. Really, there are so many of us who are in this world of technology who I really believe are leading a revolution that is improving people's lives. So with that, if we can cue the video, I'd appreciate it. Thank you.
Human rights situation often deteriorate very quickly, and the faster we can get the information and we can react to the situation, it can be a real game changer.
New technologies are advancing so rapidly, and technology companies can advise us on how best to use those technologies to protect and promote human rights.
Our objective is automatic damage mapping, because after the disaster, the government needs the damage map to carry out the effective rescue. If we can save the time to grasp the ground damage information, we are able to save a lot of life and facilities.
In a new partnership with the World Bank, United Nations, and tech industry partners, we'll be better able to predict when and where famine will occur.
Operation Smile's vision really sinks in with what I feel is a fundamental human right.
What the volunteers do for the children may seem like a small thing, but they're able to change the lives of the families forever.
We're creating a chatbot-based experience for refugees coming out of the Syria conflict. The purpose is to have displaced youth find a way to discover and access learning materials. You can engage directly with the course content.
It's just the beginning of the impact that we hope to have with the tools at our disposal.
Thank you very much.
Thanks. You get to follow that.
Yes, well, you know what, I believe in that kind of utopian vision for trade, and so that's why I'm very comfortable following that. eBay has been talking about trade in small businesses for years now. I mean, Sarah mentioned most of you probably know most of us. I think we put out our first paper in the eBay Public Policy Lab on trade and small business in like 2011. And, you know, this many years later now, I'm actually going to be speaking at a USAID conference tomorrow. And, you know, I was really just kind of focused on what my panel was. And when I actually looked at the agenda, it turned out it's 4 days of panel after panel on all these different issues, including logistics, including finance, including services, all about the ability for technology to enable small business trade and development. And I'm thinking to myself, I'm on like day 4, and I really just kind of like do the opening intro kind of thing. But it also made me think that certainly, I think by now, most trade professionals do understand that technology is enabling a completely different kind of trade. And what that kind of trade is an ability of almost anybody who is connected to technology to be able to be an exporter at a package level. And I've been years called it package level trade as opposed to essentially container ship trade. And the idea that it's facilitated by platforms. The internet is a platform. Platforms like eBay are commerce platforms. You then have payments platforms. And then you have logistics platforms. And when you combine them, my number one message would be essentially, if you use them to sell things at even a tiny level, and the number we've always used at eBay is $10,000. If you sell $10,000, you will be an exporter 99% of the time. You'll become an exporter. And that is such a small enterprise compared to what are traditional exporters that it creates all these dynamics, like 2% of traditional businesses export, 99% of these micro enterprises on platforms export. But because everybody seems to know this now, I think the new data point I bring today is to answer the question of why does this matter? Now, it matters because, as Matt was just saying, we sort of intuitively understand there's this world of good, almost kind of a fairness concept. Letting everyone do something that's always been reserved for the giants is sort of intuitively, at least many of us probably think, is a good thing. But the fact is that there are economic and social benefits, and one of the biggest ones has to do with the problem of economic concentration and the problem of what seems to be a lack of inclusion in the traditional economy. And we've recently looked at data regarding the net creation of new enterprises, micro businesses, in the traditional economy in the US compared to on eBay from a county perspective. And if you look at the counties in the US, there's a group in town here, the Economic Innovation Group, who has segmented off the US counties based on well-being. And if you take their well-being, basically, index, and you look at enterprise formation, you see that, shockingly, there's enterprise formation and growth going on in the well-off counties, and there's basically none, and the economies are shrinking in the lowest quadrant. And in fact, you can sort of, at a thumbnail level, a third of Americans live in really well-off places, a third of Americans live in places that are not really that well-off, but are doing okay, and a third of Americans are living in places, which is largely rural America, where actually not only is there not growth like there is in the well-off places, but there's shrinking going on. And if you look at the eBay data, actually the growth of net enterprises is just about the same across the board. And why is that? Well, I would posit that it's because in the traditional business model, you're dependent on local demand. Now, what that means is that if you're unlucky enough to be in a place where local demand is not great, and that could be Eastern Kentucky, it could be Croatia, it could be Namibia, it could be a lot of places in the world. A lot of people in the world are unlucky when it comes to where they are located. And in a traditional economy that is built around traditional business models, where your fortunes are largely driven by who's around you, kind of sucks to be you if you're in one of those places. But with the internet and these platforms, suddenly you have an ability. Now, it's not like you're better off. You're not better off if you're located in a place where local demand is really weak. But because of these technologies, you have an ability to break in other places. And suddenly, all of that demand that is in the places that are well off are now available to regular people. And that's why where Economic Innovation Group showed that half of all the new enterprises created in America between 2011 and 2015 were in just 20 counties. We have 3,100 counties in America. 20 counties had 50% of all the new enterprises, and they were in just 7 states. On eBay, to get to that point of 50%, you get 76 counties. It's across 24 states. Across the board, you see much more balance and inclusion. And so whether it's trade between Eastern Kentucky and California, or it's trade between Eastern Kentucky and France and the UK, the fact is the ability to use technology to reach beyond your local market is the fundamental reason why these technologies really matter. And from a purpose perspective of why do we care? Because honestly, really big companies doing pretty well. But there are so many people in the world, so many enterprises out there that are not big companies and that are not fortunate enough to be living in an area where actually everything is great. And it's just the opposite. These technologies allow people to reach beyond that, and that's really good. Thanks. And I'm sorry I went over Sarah, but
That's okay.
Matthew got me very excited.
I felt your passion. Ralph.
Thanks, Sarah. Happy to be here today. Glad to see everybody. Going to talk about the logistics side of this, as Brian talked about. A lot of talk earlier about moving ones and zeros around the world, which is important. We're going to talk about moving packages around the world. In fact, we move 14 million every day. And I don't know if you're like me, but I think a lot of you have asked this question, because even before I joined FedEx, I asked myself, when I would get a FedEx package the next day from ordering it something, I said, how do they do that? It's pretty amazing that we're able to deliver a package now connecting 99% of the world in 2 days, essentially. And if you think about the power of that and what that means, the enabling factor of that network to what we were talking about, to the opportunities for small businesses, people around the world to now sell and access markets around the world, it's pretty astounding. But it hasn't been easy to do that. We've been developing our network for 40 years. I can give you some numbers as to what it takes to do that. It takes 670 planes serving 650 airports with 185,000 trucks and vans and 21,000 locations and 425,000 people. So it's a pretty big network, and that's how we do it. And it's growing. E-commerce is growing our business, and of course, a lot of our business is small businesses. We've got customer testimonials on our website every day that I could reference, but I know Brian has talked about it. He's passionate about it. It really is exciting to see. And I think it's just getting started with the mobile technologies now, as our CEO says. Anybody in the world has an order device in their pocket, and that's going to continue to grow as mobile technology spreads. So it's just getting started, and it's really exciting. But there are some challenges out there, and these are the things that we are dealing with and working on behalf of our customers in the physical world. And part of it is the border. There's different words to describe it, but let's just say it's a big increase in single packages coming across borders, and this is putting a strain on customs' ability to deal with it. They're already kind of laboring under scarce resources. So we're seeing actually increased scrutiny on some of these small packages and e-commerce packages around the world. We're seeing efforts to put administrative steps in there. We're seeing efforts to tax it. Of course, governments also see this as a huge opportunity to tax. And of course, we're also seeing, this is a very disruptive technology, we're seeing retailers around the world who don't yet see e-commerce as an opportunity for them, rather they see it as a challenge to their business. And so they're nervous about their ability to adapt and compete with this new dynamic. And so they're pushing their governments to do what they can to slow down the flow of e-commerce around the world. So we're busy working on those things. A lot of things we're doing. We're excited about the WTO e-commerce initiative that was mentioned earlier. A group of us have been kind of pushing for that for quite some time. We're excited to see it launched at the last ministerial meeting. One of our key priorities, of course, is to have trade facilitation be a part of that negotiation so that we can talk about how to facilitate the movement of these packages. And it's not clear right now whether trade facilitation is going to be part of it, but I can say that everybody on this panel and others are making our case that it should be. We're also working through the WCO, World Customs Organization. There's an e-commerce working group, and the WCO is looking at this, trying to come up with standards and guidelines and best practices for customs administrations to deal with this surging volume. And a lot of the discussion is around data. What data is available, who has that data, who should send that data, who's responsible for that data. Because one of the concerns that we're hearing around the world is e-commerce now means that there are hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of new participants in the global supply chains. As before, as he said, as Brian said, it was containers. You knew both parties on either end. It was business to business. Now we've got someone selling something from their garage to an individual. So these customs administrations have never seen these entities. They're not known. And so that creates anxiety for them. And so I think our challenge is to be able to use technologies to come up with ways to give our border agencies the comfort they need, the tools they need to effectively manage this. We think there needs to be much more reliance on risk management rather than inspecting. The data is there. Use that data to do risk management. That's the only way you're going to be able to do it. The second thing we think is going to be important is a new trusted trader model for the e-commerce. You know, today CTPAT, for instance, is the U.S. model. Well, that's a kind of a big, cumbersome program that involves a lot of paperwork and all this. We're going to have to find a new model that allows small traders around the world to sign up and to become kind of a known trusted trader in this new flow of goods, so that they can receive facilitations at the border, and that we can use technology to continue to promote and allow this really dynamic trade to grow. So that's what we're going to be working on, and I think it is an opportunity, because technology will allow us to address a lot of these things if we do it smartly.
Thank you.
Okay, thanks. Hi. Well, I'm happy to be here, and I agree wholeheartedly with all of my colleagues. I'll try to add something different from our perspective. So I'm with BT, that's British Telecom, communications, not oil, just to be clear. I've had many conversations where I've eventually realized that people misheard, so just to be clear. So while our heritage is as the world's oldest telecommunications company, the majority of what we do today has little to do about pure telecom. So outside the UK, which is the focus for today, we provide communication services and ICT solutions, things like cloud facilitation and cybersecurity, two really big ones for us, to medium and large enterprises and government institutions in over 180 countries. And the topics today really matter to us, not least because we're one of the top 10 movers of data globally, with about 50 data centers. And as we've heard, much of today's trade is digital, and almost all trade, whether in goods or services, is digitally enabled, and therefore dependent on the data, global data flows that communications providers offer and supply. And the volume of these data is only set to grow with AI, as Matthew talked about, machine-to-machine communications, IoT. It's really only going one way, and Industry 4.0 generally. And the global value chains that support modern trade cannot really not exist without communications providers as well, in addition to logistics, finance, and other colleagues that we've heard from today. So comm services really are throughout the global value chain. So BT, for example, we help companies and customers get to really difficult places, provide trace and track for manufacturers, help pharmaceuticals get new medicines to market, help companies expand without environmentally damaging or really costly travel, and so on. So essentially, we act as a data logistics company focused on making our customers' data accessible globally and on a high-quality basis and secure end-to-end across what's really complex global supply chains. And our customers like FedEx, Visa, others here look to us to ensure that they can provide these innovative services for their customers as well. So all of this is just to say that for us, looking at digital trade, it's about more than business to consumer. It's also business to business and how those supply chains function. And it's about more than big companies, as we've discussed. It's about the SMEs. So about 50% of our supply base are SMEs, and we have a research center outside of London called Industrial Park, where we have about 100 companies. We do competitions focused on SMEs and innovation. We have global scouting presence. So SMEs, digital trade also allows SMEs not only to reach out and find new customers, but also to become integrated into larger supply chains. And we certainly support the WTO e-commerce agenda items on that front. And we were looking at a recent World Bank study that showed that where resources were focused on helping SMEs join well-established value chains, the benefits are seen all around. So just a couple of quick priorities for us from our perspective on promoting digital trade. So everybody said this, I probably don't need to, I'm preaching to the choir here, but data flows are the backbone of the digital economy and really crucial to boosting growth in all sectors, including SMEs. And we need the continued ability to transfer data across borders. And not to make this about GDPR, but to do this in line with data protection norms and in a way that enhances consumer and customer trust. And no data localization obligations, right? So such obligations harm us, but they disproportionately hurt SMEs as they attempt to enter foreign markets, adopt cloud services, operate more efficiently, and generally data localization obligations increase cost and decrease scale. And lastly for us, we firmly believe that the e-commerce agenda needs to include discussion on telecom services and global competition norms. So most of our customers rely upon a dedicated network to enable secure, reliable access that allows them to innovate and meet the needs of their customers. And really the success of many companies and our customers' experiences with globalization, the cloud, and communications generally depends upon an underlying network global infrastructure that is competitive, open, and affordable. So we really feel that we need to see telecoms network access regimes in sort of all markets that are competitive, open, and affordable, and consistently applied in line with WTO norms. And we feel that this creates a better environment not just for us, but across all sectors and for SMEs as well. The U.S. Small Business Administration has actually long advocated that a competitive market with fair access is essential for the provision of affordable and innovative services for SMEs. So I won't go on any longer. Yes, just at a high level, in short, we really feel that ICT services must be given a high priority if we are to reap the benefits that trade agreements are meant to provide, both for large and small businesses alike.
Thank you. So I think you've all done a very good job of talking about the benefits of the digital economy for enhanced inclusiveness. Yet, we've been hearing about a rise in global digital protectionism. So can you, from your perspectives, can you help us unpack that? What do you think is driving some of this protectionism? And then since we know, and since you've articulated so well some of the benefits, what are the right policy solutions to address this type of insecurity? And I think, Ralph, you talked sort of very well from the regulatory perspective, the concerns that you're seeing coming out of some of the border protection agencies about risk management and their ability to make sure that they're able to have the control that they want to do what they feel like is part of their mandate. So what are the other issues that are driving this, and what are the right solutions? And I think if it's okay, we'll just, actually, do you want to start? Do you want to start at the end and go this way?
Either way.
Okay, let's start with Jen.
Okay, that's a very, very big question. I think it does feel as though there has been, as you said, a trend towards protectionism generally, and we certainly feel that as a British-based company, but obviously based headquarters here as well and everywhere. So I think we can't deny that there are real concerns around cybersecurity and so on that I think drive some people's fears, right? And that's a huge space for us in trying to ensure that networks are secure, supply chains are secure. But that is possible to do, and that is not mutually exclusive in terms of stifling data flows or things like that. You can have both of those things in our view. And also, I think as we see innovations, as we see the race to 5G and so on, some countries, I think, some areas, some leaders tend to try to come in and use protectionism as a way to get ahead. And obviously, I think that's part of what we see in some places too. But I think that the innovation and ingenuity and sort of the open markets actually are what is going to get us there rather than the other way around. Did that answer your question?
Yeah, I think so. I think we also want to think about positing what are the right policy frameworks, what's the right type of ecosystem that achieves that balance of government oversight and, truly what are the right interests of governments in terms of protect, but also what enables this sort of really innovative and digital economy.
Yeah, sorry, to do one other thing really quickly, I can just say on data protection norms, one interesting thing that I think we can see is if there are the right data transfer mechanisms in place, that can also coexist with things like, we abide by the GDPR. We fully implemented it. And I think what we see is that, that can be in place as long as we are sure that there are the right data transfer mechanisms implemented elsewhere globally that enable us to operate. So.
Great. Ralph, do you want to comment?
Sure. Well, I think I mentioned our two priorities. which are more use of risk assessment and smarter use of the data that's out there. That's really the only way we're going to be able to manage the volume effectively and to give, as you say, the border authorities the tools that they need. And I think, in some countries that we do a good job of that. The United States certainly wants to do that, and all of us are in conversations with the U.S. border agencies about how we can do better and how we can work with them and how we can improve the system and manage this in an efficient way. But I will say that the concept of risk management and using data and analytics to control the border is not something that is practiced around the world to a great degree of consistency. Everybody's seen the red light or the green light. Sometimes that's the most sophisticated system they have, or we're just going to kind of inspect everything to make sure that nothing gets through. Of course, neither of those systems is really effective and can really slow down the movement of goods. And so what we're all about is talking about the values of risk assessment and how it can be used. And that's why we're excited that, the WTO Trade Facilitation Agreement talks about and requires countries to use risk assessment, as does the recently completed USMCA. So this is a concept that's not new, but it really becomes much more important now in this e-commerce environment. And so that leads to the second part about how can we get more of the participants kind of in the system in what we used to call a known kind of status. In other words, how do they make themselves known to the border agencies that they're dealing with around the world so that those agencies have a familiarity with them and can say, yes, we know who this is, we don't need to stop this, they have a good history, good track record. And so this is something I think we need to do a lot more, give a lot more thought to, again, new models of trusted trader programs that work in an e-commerce environment.
Thanks.
So Sarah, I'm going to take the first part of your question, which is everything we've all said makes one think, wow, it's obvious that allowing opportunity and have everyone be able to trade is a really great thing, and it's good for the economy, it's good for the society. It addresses concerns about the fact that global trade is really dominated by a relative handful of giant companies, really benefits a relative handful of really rich countries. Of course, everybody would want this. Shockingly, that's not actually true. Why isn't it happening? Ralph mentioned anxiety. There's a lot of anxiety, which is another word for fear. Disruption and change is not generally really popular anywhere, especially among those who have it pretty good. So in economies anywhere, whether it's really rich countries or not really rich countries, market by market, there are always people doing pretty well. Now, in many cases, it's not a lot of people, it's not a lot of companies, but there are always those who have. And anything that sort of threatens to disrupt an economy that things are working pretty well, generally incumbents think that that is not a positive thing, and it causes anxiety. Governments get anxiety about their business model, which is taxes and how they tax, for example. So the reason I would say why is, yes, some of us are like true believers that this leads to a better economy and a better future, but actually there are plenty of forces out there who don't want that change and who are totally happy with letting people sit around and talk about how great it is for small businesses to trade. But then when it actually comes down to like, wow, like 1 million or 10 million small businesses that you don't know their brand. I literally was once on a phone call where the Canadians were like, no, we totally support Trusted Trader. But you're talking about some guy in his garage in Texas. How do we know who that is? Well, that's the challenge. And part of it is, well, how can we make maybe people who don't really want a lot of change be comfortable with some change with like these technology answers? Part of it is actually getting people to recognize that there are some important reasons for change. One of the most important reasons for change is there's general agreement that the traditional economy actually is not working that well. that there are real problems with growth, even in the countries that are best off, that there are real problems with inclusion. There are real problems when the way that an entrepreneur is going to make a future is going to have to be to move somewhere, one of the few places where things are really going well. And so first part is, yes, there's anxiety, yes, there's protectionism, and some people have to be saying that actually we need to make these changes. So we need to find a balance between how things have always been and the fact that some things really do need to change in order to get to a better result. And part of the better result is opening up trade opportunities for everyone, opening up growth opportunities to many more people. And so, I mean, trusted trader is a great concept and one that eBay has supported for a long time. But let's not have that become a new kind of control. If the answer to a small business trading is that some big enterprise that certain government entity, for example, is comfortable with, is actually running the trade. Well, then, do you really have small business trade? Yeah. And I'm not sure you do. And so I think it's finding a balance between, like risk-based trade could be managed by a few enterprises. It could be the reality that actually, while there's a lot of anxiety, like many kinds of anxiety, it's not actually based in data. Like, you don't find greater risk in large volumes of very small business trade on a platform like eBay, and the fact that traditional commerce has always included various kinds of bad activities. It's not like traditional commerce was, everything was perfectly fine, there was no counterfeits, there was no problems, there was no theft, there was no fraud. No, actually, that's been part of commerce forever. It's a part of commerce as well with data. I would actually argue that the risk-based, because there's so much actually data to track, actually means that there's less risk. So this is just to say, a lot of this is caused by anxiety and a desire to protect ways that things are run today. And part of the answer has to be to say that we need to bring about change, which actually is going to change the way things are done, but that the results are going to be better and fair.
So, Matthew, knowing that and taking what you're saying about the anxiety, isn't there a role for some of these platforms to maybe do more to lessen the anxiety? I mean, do we have a responsibility to make sure, we keep talking about the guy in his garage, but that guy runs through a pipe that runs through a platform that runs through, I mean, the data is sort of there in some ways. What are the providers and what are the platforms doing in a way to reduce that anxiety?
I'm so glad you put it that way. Because where I wanted to go with that, you know what? There are a lot of good reasons to be anxious about what technology is doing. There's a lot of reason to question and to set a pretty high bar about whether you should trust something before you turn it on and use it, whether it be a product or a service. And it's incumbent upon every one of us in the business community who offers one of those services to earn your trust. And if we haven't, then you shouldn't use the product. And I think that's never been more important in the world of artificial intelligence, where the ethical minefields are just mind-blowing. And as we develop these technologies, we each have to have clear frameworks. And we have to work together to build those with each other as a business community and with governments to get those right. I will say also, I heard some comments earlier in the day about a deregulatory agenda, and understand that. But I think it's also incredibly important in this age of new technology to have good regulation and to get regulations right. Because if we're going to advocate for a trade agenda that opens borders to data, which we firmly and strongly believe in, there also have to be supporting policies that are achieve those regulatory objectives that are real and appropriate on privacy and on cybersecurity. If you get those right and you marry those with these open policies, that's where the magic happens, and that's what we support.
That's great, and that sort of leads into my next question, which is we have a new trade agreement, the USMCA, that has new standards. We heard before some of the best standards on digital trade. In your opinion, are these the best standards? Can they be improved upon? What's good? What do you think about them? And I'm going to start with Matthew.
So I do want to start out with a compliment. I've seen some of my colleagues from the Office of the U.S. Trade Representative here, including some from that office who negotiated that digital chapter. And they should really be complimented because the work that they did was truly extraordinary. We do think that if you look at that chapter of the agreement on issues like data flows and privacy and cybersecurity, it's the best thing we've ever seen in a trade agreement in those provisions in that regard. That's not the end of the story. That's a great centerpiece for what trade policy can do, and we think we should build from that and continue to work as a global community on those privacy and cybersecurity policies at the same time.
Great. Brian.
So I would say for larger data-driven, data-based companies in the United States, it's an excellent agreement and a step forward. Issues, we've had a lot of different people talk about issues like data localization and cross-border data flows. These are important issues, and they're especially important for larger businesses. The agreement ended up not being as strong on a core tax issue. eBay and I think FedEx are both up here saying there's a part of digitally enabled trade that's literally like packages. And when you're going to talk about small businesses and trade, it's essentially package level trade. The Canadians went into the negotiation wanting to protect what is called the de minimis or a low value threshold. Essentially, they want to apply their local consumption tax to foreign retailers because they're very explicit. They believe it protects their local retailers. And that's protectionism. Let's use taxes to protect a local business because they're very concerned about their ability to compete. When it was a bilateral US-Mexico, the Mexicans had agreed to meaningfully increase their de minimis. When it became a trilateral at the very end, they said, well, the Canadians get to protect their local small business retailers from internet competition. We think we should too. And so the agreement is really, it's not as good as it should be. On this core tax issue, which from the perspective of impacting the competitive ability of a small business, whether in Canada or the US or Mexico, to use the internet to trade with consumers in the other countries. And by the way, Canadian small businesses on eBay are very, very successful selling to Americans. Mexican small businesses on eBay are very, very successful selling to Canadians and Americans. The fact is, small businesses using the internet are actually able to compete and do really well. But when you throw tax barriers in front of them that were designed for a traditional retail environment, you really penalize them, and that's a negative. So that agreement could be better on that front. And we hope maybe those two countries will agree in their implementing stage to recognize the value of reducing taxes on small businesses.
What about you, Ralph?
I would add that I think the outcome on de minimis that Brian mentioned and Laura mentioned earlier, I think reflects the challenges that I talked about in the last segment. I think it's a very good reflection of some of the things we're facing. So what we're focused on now is taking some of the other very good provisions in the Chapter 7, in the Trade Facilitation chapter, and as Brian said, making sure that those are not just words on paper, that those are actually implemented, and that we take this as an opportunity to really do some innovative things at the border to truly facilitate the movement of goods, including, of course, e-commerce goods. And that's going to be our focus. I think for example, there's one clause in there that says parties shall allow for periodic assessment and payment of duties and taxes. And if you implement that in the right way, what that means is that can get you to a point where you're taking all this administrative burden of the payment of duties and taxes away from the border. And it now becomes an account-based payment system where I'm paying all the duties and taxes that I owe for a series of shipments over the last week, month, quarter, whatever it is. And all of a sudden, if you really did that, using technology to do that, that could be a big improvement. So we're going to be looking at things like that and really pushing to see if we can make some progress on some of those facilitative provisions.
Yeah, I'd agree that it's very good on digital in many ways around forced localization, data flows, and those sort of issues. The only thing I think we'd add is that around telecoms, we would like to see more on that. For EU-Mexico, for instance, sort of similar to what Matthew was saying, EU-Mexico set out that sort of the absence of rules of the road needed to be fact-based as well, right? So showing that market conditions are appropriate and so on, that needs to be based on some evidence too. So, that's the sort of thing we'd support including in future agreements.
Great. I think we have microphones if there are questions from the audience. I can call on people, but I think it's easier. This is our first panel. We haven't done the logistics. I actually think it's easier if you all, I guess, raise your hand. I see one over there. But are there questions from the audience? Doug, do you have a question? Okay. I think there's a microphone right here, if you don't mind. Thank you.
Hi, Doug Palmer with Politico. I guess this question is for Brian and Ralph, and it goes back to this issue that Jonathan was talking about earlier in the session with Kevin Hassett, where apparently, I'm just learning about this, others probably already know, there's this footnote that could potentially allow the U.S. to lower the de minimis level as part of the implementing legislation. I just wonder, what is eBay and FedEx's view of that? What impact would that have? And then also, again, another issue I'm just sort of learning about, but this morning, President Trump withdrew from this postal treaty and saying it's like a subsidy for China to ship counterfeit goods to the United States. What impact would that have on eBay and FedEx's business?
I'll address the first. Yeah, we're aware of the footnote, and we've got some concerns about it. We don't think it's the right approach. As we've been talking about, there's millions of consumers and small businesses have been benefiting from the U.S. de minimis level, and we think it's a great economic boon for the country. And efforts to lower that would really hurt our leadership, I think, in e-commerce. So that's an issue that we're going to be continued to focus on and talk about. The announcement that you just mentioned about the UPU, what I will say is that we heard this was coming, but I haven't seen it, so we'll need to look at it and see what it says, and then we'll probably have a statement on that later on.
I think Ralph's answer is excellent on both, and would simply say that on the de minimis, we believe that the Congress acted very clearly on the issue of U.S. de minimis just a couple of years ago. From the perspective of the sort of trade negotiation framework for all trade agreements, certainly, congressional direction in the form of negotiating objectives and things are important. And, there certainly hasn't been any congressional directive to move towards a lower U.S. de minimis, and so we're confident that the broad and bipartisan support for the current U.S. de minimis level will be reflected in the final legislation, and certainly from an eBay perspective, we've really tried to explain how, from the context of things like e-commerce returns, that the de minimis in the U.S. is really important because you have these small businesses in the U.S. that are exporting over internet platforms. And, part of the retail environment is the need to be able to handle returns, and having products get taxed coming back to a small business is a really negative experience for that small business exporter. And so, we think the change in the U.S. de minimis was a well thought out policy, and so, our focus is on the fact that has a lot of support. I'm not up to speed on what the president announced this morning. I was prepping to be on this really exciting panel, so and so I don't have any comment on that at all.
Thanks. John.
Hello, it's John Murphy with the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. Terrific panel. Thank you very much. Let me first just say very quickly, speaking for a very broad business organization, completely agree with the comments on de minimis. The USMCA implementing legislation should not be an opportunity to lower the U.S. de minimis rate, and we're going to be watching that closely. But my question is about digital trade, and a concern that I have I've noticed in the past couple of days, it feels like we've lost a couple of battles overseas. It looks like Vietnam has gone forward with a really draconian version of a law there on data localization. And I feel like I've reviewed 15 letters and comments where we've weighed in. There's been delegations to Vietnam. We've weighed in with visiting delegations. And also in India, where there's data localization related to electronic payments. And what more can we and the business community be doing on this front to effectively advocate and educate on the importance of openness on data? Thank you very much.
Who wants to start?
I'll say that I think that at the end of the day, as I think you've probably taken from my comments, I think that internet-enabled commerce is a development tool more than anything. So at the same time, protectionism is a very real and probably growing phenomenon, big picture in the trade world. And so it's a real big challenge to have the positives of this kind of commerce as a development tool be able to prevail over some really strong protectionist sentiments in all kinds of markets around the world. And so the main thing that I would advocate for the business community to recognize is that free trade policies, as we heard Kevin Hassett say, are really driven by this idea of everybody lowers barriers in order for everyone to benefit from more commerce. And so personally, I would be looking to the US to recognize how the things that we're looking for countries to lower their barriers, which how many times have we already heard cross-border data flows and data localization? These are the kinds of things that we clearly believe are important to really important segments of our economy. Well, what are the things that we hope these other countries would recognize they're going to benefit from? And what's number one? Small business trade. And what do those small businesses need? Well, small businesses need access to markets that have a lot of demand, buyers. And so I would be arguing that, it has to be all these different sides agreeing that they're going to win if these kind of barriers are lowered. And if it's just about digital, like Western digital companies, not having to deal with like local data localization kind of laws or cross-border data, that's going to feel kind of one-sided to them. And so it's important to make it very two-sided so that their ability to export is actually going up. And
Matthew, I think you wanted to jump in there.
Yeah. First, just as an aside, if you're visiting from out of town and you haven't met John Murphy, he's one of the wisest people on trade in DC, so pull him aside afterward. John, you're absolutely right that I think in a lot of our advocacy, we've run into a wall with making the same arguments over and over, and people reading the letter and proceeding with policies that we've made a long extended case here for are not good. So I think you're wise to say, how can we reflect on how we can do this better? And I read a book, just finished it, a number of you have probably read it too, and one of the maxims in it was, first seek to understand and then to be understood. And maybe the mistake we've made is to try and make ourselves understood first without understanding where it's coming from. And what I mean by that, to be very specific, is maybe we need to look deeper at why countries are proposing these policies and why they think they are necessary, to really listen and hear that, and then from that basis come back with, we hear you from what you're trying to achieve. We have some ideas on how you can achieve that goal, and how we don't, in our experience, think that these policies are going to achieve that. Here are some ways you can actually do it without cutting off benefits to millions of people in your country that we know you want to help. And so at least starting from that point. Thank you.
Yeah, I just add, I think we've seen some similar situations, for example, at the ITU, International Telecommunications Union, where you see countries who maybe feel as though they have not been able to get the full benefit of the technological revolution, right? They're left behind in a way, and then in turn seek to sort of erect barriers rather than take them down. And working with business and governments to sort of show practical use cases of how you can implement these technologies, how you can use them to your benefit, whether you're a small business or a country or government or whatnot. So, I don't know. At first, I was going to say we should ask government, ask the government officials, how can we help? That's a question that I think, so often in our engagement, maybe we don't bring that up. That should always be one of the first questions, right? But I think trying to reach out and, as Matthew said, understand where they're coming from first and create a way to share best practices with countries who might not fully have the benefits would be helpful.
And I would think there's a role for capacity building too.
Right, exactly.
Sure. We have one more question here.
Irving Williamson, U.S. International Trade Commission. You talked a lot today about small businesses, and traditionally, intermediaries have played an important role in helping small businesses engage in international trade. Thinking about like government export promotion agencies, chambers of commerce, export trading companies, things like that. The ITC has done studies in the past on role of small business in international trade and how different governments have supported the small business. So I was just wondering, in this new digital age, do we need new intermediaries? Do the old ones still have a role? I mean, are the intermediaries now FedEx and eBay, or are there others? So I just want you to comment on that, because I do still think there's small companies need help when they engage in the international market.
I think Ralph's going to start.
Yeah, that's a great question. And, we were, I believe, the launch partner with the U.S. Commercial Service, now it's probably 13, 14 years ago, on their export promotion activities. And we continue today to work with the Commerce Department to support a lot of their export promotion, SME kind of awareness events around the country. We're always engaged with them. We think it's incredibly valuable. We did an in-depth initiative with them where we identified our own customers who we thought were kind of poised to really increase their export footprint, and we connected them to the Commerce's Gold Key program and some of the other export promotion and training programs they have. And the results were actually pretty stunning. I don't have the numbers now, but once those small businesses were kind of, once they crossed that Rubicon and saw that, okay, so they've been exporting to Mexico, then they said, well, how do I export to more countries? And as soon as they got comfortable with that, we saw their business expand, and they started selling to more countries. So there is a role for helping these small businesses, because they don't have the resources to get the information they need. They're intimidated by the regulatory challenges that they face in selling to different markets. So we think it's a very important aspect of what governments can do to help promote exports by their small business, is to set up these kinds of programs that give them the basic information they need, the tools, where can they find these resources. This is something, we've worked with different business associations in ASEAN, for instance, who are doing this, helping small businesses that are having the same kind of events there, where they're inviting small businesses and they're giving them the tools and the information they need to overcome their fears and to guide them in the right direction in terms of what they need to start exporting more. And the results are really, really encouraging.
I think Matthew and then Brian.
Yeah, just quickly, and Commissioner Williamson, thanks for the great question, and great to see so many colleagues from ITC, which continues to do such great work within our trade policymaking apparatus here. Just to say, the question's very pertinent. What I've been really pleased to see is that Commerce and the State Department, which have traditionally been focused on helping U.S. businesses of every size to export more, have recognized exactly the problem that you've indicated, and there's been increasing partnership, I think, and I'm going to butcher the name, but there are this new program of digital attachés at State and at Commerce that are trying to work with businesses to succeed in this digital world. I think there's more that we can do together with them. There's been good collaboration already, but there's more work for all of us to do.
Thanks, Brian.
So I would just add that, first of all, I would reiterate what Ralph said. eBay has worked with the Commerce Department. I think it's America Trades is the program, and certainly these digital attachés are a valuable thing. I would just add that there are different size enterprises now that can trade, and that the ability for really micro to engage is totally different than the past, and there are different methods of participating in trade. So you have very traditional trade, you have global value chains. There's a certain scale business that actually targeting foreign markets is a strategy. But then there's platforms. And the idea behind platform commerce is actually, in general, that the platform doesn't individually sort of coach anybody up as to how to use the platforms, but instead these platforms themselves are, successful platforms, successful software. I think I probably used Microsoft software for 30 years, and I'm not sure I've ever actually talked to anybody from Microsoft about how to use my software. I'm not lucky enough at eBay to have an IT person in town, so I pretty much got to struggle through my Microsoft-based computer to work, right? But that's the idea behind eBay and behind Facebook and Google and all these platforms. And so platform-enabled trade, in many ways, is a different kind of trade, and it does lend the idea that enabling or sort of facilitating the use of platforms follows a little different model than the sort of traditional export sort of promotion or coaching model. And I do think that from the perspective of enabling small and micro business trade, that how the platforms can enable it is still something that I think can probably be done even better. A big part of it is countries opening up the markets to the platform-enabled trade and the platforms. That's where the data localization and all these things are so key. Everybody doing platform trade means that these platforms need to be able to operate.
Okay, we have 2 minutes left. Steve has a question, and then we're going to do a lightning round. I'm going to hold you to 30 seconds. Go.
Thanks, Sarah. I'll keep it very short. Steve Simchak from the American Insurance Association. I've got a quick comment and a quick question. Quick comment, I heard that ring in my ear of the Universal Postal Union, so I just had to point out on behalf of the insurance industry that the Universal Postal Union not only has issues with postal rates, but also is legendary for encouraging foreign governments to set up state-owned insurers and banks that compete on an unlevel playing field with private sector insurers and banks. So just wanted to put that out there. But my question is about privacy
Our next
regulations.
panelist, Steve.
My question, though, is about privacy regulations, and obviously this panel excellently spoke a bit about the importance of data flows for this type of trade. And I'm just wondering, when you're working with small and medium enterprises, do you find that they have trouble dealing with privacy regulations that might restrict data flows or restrict their ability to store the data? In other words, are the regulations so monolithic that it's difficult for them to operate in that regulatory framework? Thank you.
Okay, you see your countdown clock. Go, Matthew.
No question that thanks Steve for the question, that as regulations grow more complicated, it is more of a challenge for those with the least capacity to deal with them. We try and do our part by making the technologies that we offer to folks completely compliant with the regulations wherever they're operating, including GDPR. We were one of the first to do that. But there's no question that there's more, we can all do more to help them to meet those challenges. Yeah, eBay users, eBay itself, on behalf of all of our users, is compliant with GDPR. Before that, we were a very early binding corporate rules participant in the European sort of privacy directive. And so from the perspective of our users as small businesses, they're essentially complying with that standard through their using eBay. And so we're comfortable with that.
Do you have an opinion? No. Okay.
Sure. So yeah, same. We're working closely a lot right now with our customers on GDPR. We've fully implemented it and support GDPR implementation globally. And we certainly help our customers as they navigate through, and also work with government on helping SMEs sort of make the right decisions in terms of technology and investments and so on that also impact their compliance with privacy regulations. Sorry.
No, we're good. So please help me thank this incredible panel. I think we've got a lot of good information out.